Well, it's a real honor to be here at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. This is a very august body for a sort of lowly journalist such as myself to be speaking at. I was going to be devoting, I thought, my talk today to some larger themes about the secrecy of the Bush administration, its claims of executive power, the war in Iraq, and others, but I figured, what the hell, maybe we should just talk about sex scandals. A Princeton alum, no doubt, no less. Any case, but I'll leave that for the sex scandals for the Q&A. Although I gotta say, as stories go, the Spitzer one is hard to beat, just in terms of, what makes a good story. I mean, nothing tops shock value and telling you something that you don't know. But let me pick up on the theme of telling you something that you don't know, because, I speak at a time that our profession is, I don't want to say so much as under siege, but it's certainly beleaguered. News organizations are having a difficult time of it, forced to cut back, circulations are dropping, for obvious reasons. First and foremost, if you give your product away for free on the internet, why should anybody continue to pay for it? And this is a rather serious dilemma for the executives of news organizations, but it's no question it's had a real-life impact. Reporting staffs have been cut back, investigative staffs have been cut back, foreign bureaus have been cut back. All the things that we do to bring the public the news has been sorely challenged. And at the same time, you have the rise of the blogosphere and the internet, people doing things like what we do, although in different ways, and I would argue with different results. But it has raised the question of are we still relevant? Is there still a role, and is there going to be a role down the road for people like Evan and myself who report on the news every week, who try to dig up stuff that the government doesn't want you to know, and tell you something that you don't know. And at the same time all these trends I've been talking about have been going on, we've also been under attack by ideologues and partisans of both the left and the right. The left sees us as having been us, and I'm speaking us in general for the mainstream media, MSM in the vernacular, for having been lapdogs for the Bush White House, for allowing it to get away with what turned out to be its utterly fraudulent claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and the threat that Iraq faced, and that we have been far too compliant in challenging those in power. And as a result, there have been some rather significant consequences for the country, because the press did not stand up to the Bush administration, because the press was far too much a cheerleader for George W. Bush in the early years of his presidency. He was able to get away with a lot. At the same time, you have ideologues on the right who still see us as being ideologically liberal, partisan, inclined to be hypercritical of the Bush administration, and that clearly is a line of attack that has traction. Just watch Fox News every night and look at their ratings. They still, Trump the other cable news networks in ratings. They still have great traction. And so clearly, they and the people who think that are speaking to a constituency. I think I have some credibility in speaking to partisans of both sides because I have taken relentless flack from partisans of both sides. During the Clinton days, I was accused of being a agent of Hillary's vast right-wing conspiracy, and during the Bush White House days, I've been accused of being hyper critical of them and being in league with the president's critics. I don't want to speak to the ideological issues here, but I do want to make a couple of points that I think are significant as a journalist and as a reporter. And that is that for all this flack we're taking, for all we in the press are beleaguered, we do still make a difference, and we have still been significant in shining a light on aspects of government action and that you would not otherwise know about. And it's not the full story. We haven't been able to give you that. We're never able to give you that. But if you take back, and I was thinking about this a little for this talk, just how we at Newsweek did play a role in helping to shine that light, it's worth talking about. Not so much because I want to pump Newsweek today in our talk, because others in other news organizations have done just as much. But I want to walk you through a little bit of how we in the press do make a difference and have been able to report on things you would not otherwise know about. I said before that this is, I think I alluded to before, that this is an extremely secretive administration. Some would argue the most secretive in ever in the history of our country. I don't know. I'm not a historian. I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly, I have been around for a while, and I can tell you that certainly of the all White Houses, all administrations only want you to know what they tell you. They are all extremely protective of internal deliberations and what they view as secrets, and they all have something to cover up. Every single administration I've covered has had things that they wanted to cover up. Some criminal, some merely politically embarrassing, but they all have the instinctive reaction. But there's no question that in the White Houses that I've dealt with, this one takes the cake. And they have been extremely protective. And part of that is, look, they came in with a mind view. I mean, all you have to do is go back and read some of what Dick Cheney said over the years before he became president, how he, I'm sorry, vice president. That was not intended. But Freudian, perhaps. Anyway, we're going to talk about Cheney a little bit. But you know, I mean, his view of executive power and his view that of executive supremacy, and that actions could be taken by the executive branch that didn't need to be reviewed or shared with the legislative branch, and certainly not with the likes of the press or the public. I think he was asked at one point, you know, then how can a president or a White House be held accountable? And his answer is, that's what we have elections for. Once you elect us, you know, shut up and be quiet. and be happy, and you'll have another chance 4 years down the road. Is basically, I think, his philosophic view, and you can get into other questions about how they waged re-election campaigns and how honest they are during those. But that's, I think, the sort of predisposition of the White House, and certainly Cheney when they came into office. And then you merge that with September 11th and the war on terror. And suddenly we went from a White House and administration that had a whole separate agenda that was completely unrelated to the war on terrorism. In fact, as we well know from the 9/11 Commission, now showed very little interest in the threat of al-Qaeda, almost to the point of ignoring it and downgrading it from a top-ranked issue during the waning days of the Clinton years to the second-tier issue during the first 9 months of the Bush White House. We went from that to overnight to a administration that was entirely oriented around the war on terror, and waging the war on terror and waging it because they viewed as the only way to wage war with extreme secrecy and stealth. And so their instinctive reaction is, we can't tell you about anything we're doing because we're now in a state of war, and therefore there is nothing about our actions that can be shared with the public. And pretty much right through the first couple of years after 9/11, you had the merging of those two, the philosophic disposition, inclinations relating to extreme executive power, with the practical realities of waging the war on terror, to essentially grant them free rein to take all sorts of actions. And I will talk about some of them as we go on, in secret, without the public knowing about it. And had it not been for the news media, the mainstream news media, challenging some of those assumptions and hard digging and hard reporting, I would contend that there is a lot that we now know that we would not know today, and we wouldn't be able to form the kinds of judgments and have the debates we have about Bush administration actions had it not been for the press. And I want to cite a few examples from our experience at Newsweek, from reporting I've done, just to show them as emblematic. Right after 9/11, the Congress voted the authorization to use military force to respond to those who attacked 9/11 and who attacked us on 9/11. A resolution that passed unanimously, but not without debate within Congress. If you go back and read some of the accounts that have since come out about the crafting of that resolution, and that was the resolution. That was the resolution that the White House used as its sort of green light to take whatever action it wanted to take in the war on terror. It had the approval from Congress. There was a debate about the wording of that resolution, about how far it should go, and whether the language of the resolution would give, how much latitude it would give the president to respond to the attacks of 9/11. And because of objections from Daschle and some of the Democrats in the Congress, what the White House asked for was constrained to make it clear that what Congress was authorizing was an authorization to use military force against those to respond to the attacks of September 11th. Right after that, indeed, within a week of that resolution passing, the White House summoned up a memo from the Justice Department, Office of Legal Counsel, a young lawyer there who was one of those who had been strategically put there, a man by the name of John Yoo, Y-O-O. You may have read something about him. He's had one of those who was very much of the Cheney view, an academic who had very much the Cheney view about executive power. And it asked for a resolution it asked for a memo that could give legal guidance on whether that resolution passed by Congress would be binding on the White House, or could the White House take additional steps beyond the wording of the resolution? All this was done in secret, of course. And on September 25th, 2001, and this is, I think, a critical day and a critical moment, a memorandum opinion for the Deputy Counsel of the President was written by John Yoo to the White House. And it was entitled, "The President's Constitutional Authority to Conduct Military Operations Against Terrorists and Nations Supporting Them," and reached conclusions that the President has broad constitutional power to take military action in response to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. The President has constitutional power not only to retaliate against any person, organization, or state suspected of involvement in terrorist attacks on the United States, but also against foreign states suspected of harboring or supporting such organizations. The President may deploy military force preemptively against terrorist organizations or the states that harbor or support them, organizations or states that harbor or support them, whether or not they can be linked to the specific terrorist incidents of September 11th. And as John Yoo went on to say in this memo, it really doesn't matter what Congress authorized here. The President has inherent executive power to take whatever action he wants against whatever target he wants, organizations or states, regardless of whether it was linked. They can be linked to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. As you go through the memo, it is truly, I would argue, one of the more astonishing documents that you can read, because if you follow through the logic, he's essentially saying that the President has inherent authority, because of what happened on September 11th, to take whatever action he so chooses. And it concludes with, what I think some people, when I first read it, found to be rather chilling language. In fact, it ends with a footnote. Neither statute can place any limits on the President's determinations as to any terrorist threat, the amount of military force to be used in response, or the method, timing, and nature of the response. These decisions under our Constitution are for the President alone to make. And then in its final footnote, in the exercise of his plenary power to use military force, the President's decisions are for him alone and are unreviewable. This was the official legal guidance and doctrine of the Bush White House. We can do whatever we want. It doesn't matter what Congress says. It doesn't matter even what the courts say. We have full plenary power to take whatever action in the military arena we want. It actually became even more chilling as you read John Yoo's memos over the next year, because as he defined military action, it came to encompass a wide range of activities, including interrogations of enemy suspects, including the incarceration of American citizens who are suspected to be enemy combatants, the indefinite incarceration of American citizens, making them unpersons. All this were put under the purview, under the rubric of these are part of the military actions that the President needs to take. At the very least, And you know, John Yoo is back in academia at Berkeley, you know, defending the doctrines he wrote about in the White House, in the Justice Department, in the government. One can debate on the margins of these, but I think that most people would say that this is a pretty significant and revealing memo about the thinking of the White House. And of this administration. And my point is, you, the public, didn't know a thing about it. The Congress of the United States knew not a thing about the legal doctrine that was being promulgated within 2 weeks of 9/11. The sort of basic legal philosophy and the full extent, how far they were taking all this, was completely known. Now, I set it up, and I bring this out, given the topic of the talk, because you do know about this today. It has been known because we, at Newsweek, got a hold of this memo, and we were able to report on it. The story of how we did so is kind of interesting, and it's not actually as much cloak and dagger as you might imagine. There was a whole backstory to it, but and we didn't get a hold of it at the time. I wish to God I could have reported on this memo a week after it occurred, or a month after it occurred, or even 6 months after it occurred. But within a couple of years, there were people who were truly disturbed about this sort of stuff and began pushing to try to get the public to know, and I eventually got a tip in December of '04 about where to find this document, and we were able to report about it in Newsweek. It's significant because it helps to put in motion, or it helps to put in context a lot else that we were able to report about over the next few years in covering the Bush White House. About 3 months after, or 4 months after that memo was written, there was another big legal debate going on inside the White House, or inside another debate. The first one wasn't a debate. There was another big legal issue that came before the White House, and that was after the war in Afghanistan, those apprehended on the battlefield, Al-Qaeda members, Taliban members, and whoever else had been swept up by bounty hunters and turned over to U.S. military forces. The U.S. government had to find a place to put them and had to figure out a way to handle them. And there was an internal deliberation about this, and the conclusion was made: we're going to send them to Guantanamo Bay, a part of the government, a part of the U.S. territory that, thanks to another friendly memo by John Yoo, the administration concluded was not within the jurisdiction of American courts. So there could be no American judicial review over what was done to them, and that they would not be afforded the basic legal protections of the Geneva Convention. And therefore, they could be interrogated any way we see fit. They could be treated any way we see fit, and there would be no review under either American law or international law, because if they were not under the protection of the Geneva Conventions, then therefore they had no standing under international law. And on January 25th, 2002, another memo is written, this time not by John Yoo, but by Alberto Gonzales, the then White House counsel for the president. And he's writing the memo because he, armed with opinions from the Justice Department and the strong push of Vice President Cheney's office, had gotten the president to sign off on a rather significant finding that those detainees captured on the battlefield would not be afforded Geneva Convention protections, and there were people in the government who were just outraged about this decision. People in the military who thought taking such a breathtaking decision would be injurious to American troops who might get picked up by others on the battlefield, and reached the conclusion that if the American government isn't going to play by the rules and isn't going to afford Geneva Convention protections to its detainees, why should we, the enemies of the United States, afford American prisoners such protections? And there was outrage by the State Department, and particularly Colin Powell, who went to the president and strongly argued, saying this is a disastrous move. We in the United States government and in international fora continually argue about the importance of upholding the rule of law. And we continue to try to find other contend that other governments must undertake its obligations under the rule of law, and how can we just unilaterally dismiss our standing to make these arguments by taking a big decision like this. So Gonzales writes a memo to the president telling him, don't back down. Don't change your opinion on this. We have to stand firm. We should not grant Geneva Convention protections to the prisoners that we are picking up on the battlefield in Afghanistan. And he goes on to list his arguments, talking about how the war against terrorism is a new kind of war. It is not the traditional clash between the nations adhering to the rules of war that form the backup. In my judgment, this new paradigm renders obsolete Geneva's strict limitations on questioning of enemy prisoners. The protections of Geneva Conventions are obsolete. We're in a new kind of war. It's a new kind of rules must apply. And then, as he goes on, listing the reasons the president should keep to this his position, he adds another that's very revealing in retrospect. In his bullet points, substantially reduces the threat of domestic criminal prosecution under the War Crimes Act. We in the government may be subject to criminal prosecution for violating American laws that were crafted to adhere to international law. It is difficult to predict, Gonzales wrote, the motives of prosecutors and independent counsels who may in the future decide to pursue unwarranted charges based on a federal law called the War Crimes Act. Your determination would create a reasonable basis in law that this section does not apply, which would provide a solid defense to any future prosecution. Isn't that interesting? In January of 2001, the people in the White House have it in their minds that they're doing something. They're doing something extraordinary that could ultimately lead to their own criminal prosecution. And they could wind up in jail. And you, President, must protect all of us by standing firm to this decision. If you say Geneva Conventions do not apply, nobody could down the road charge us for not adhering to the rule of international law. Gonzales's arguments carried the day. About a week or two later, the president announced his decision. It was colored with a lot of language about how we were still going to treat prisoners humanely, subject to military necessity, I think was the sort of caveat language there, which under John Yu's interpretation basically meant, whatever we please or however we want. It didn't get a lot of coverage at the time. Nobody knew about this memo. Nobody knew about the standing that the legal arguments that the White House was taking. Nobody knew about that they already suspected that they themselves might be doing something that could subject them to criminal prosecution. It was a sort of one-day story. President makes Geneva Convention, the world moved on, and pretty much the entire issue was forgotten. It was forgotten until 2.5 years later, when those graphic photos from Abu Ghraib showed up, first in CBS News and in the New Yorker, and then all over the world. A huge controversy erupted as to how the hell did this ever happen? How did we get down this road of treating people like this? And I got a call from one of those who had been outraged in the government at the time that this memo was written, and said, you don't know the half of it. You don't know the half of the story. And I got a faxed copy a couple of days later of the Gonzales memo and a whole lot of other memos that had been written by John Yoo around this whole issue of the treatment of detainees. And we were able to publish them in the next issue of Newsweek, and we were able to post them on our website so people could read them. And I think we were able to illuminate somewhat some of the huge conflicts that were going on within the government, and the really strong and sort of eye-catching stands that this White House was taking. A third area occurs, let's see, on my timeline, I'm up to May 2004. 2 months earlier, there was another extraordinary scene development in the administration that nobody knew anything about. And that was March 10th, 2004, an incident you may now have heard about where Attorney General John Ashcroft is stricken ill at the hospital with an extreme case of pancreatitis. The administration has embarked, using under John Yoo's legal memos, on an extraordinary terrorist surveillance program that is allowing them to listen in and listen in on the phone calls and read the emails of American citizens without a court order. Nobody in the world knows anything about it. No member of the public knows anything about it. And they are seeking a approval from the Justice Department to extend the program, the secret surveillance program that is allowing them to, allowing the National Security Agency under White House directive to listen in on phone calls of American citizens without a court order. And a number of lawyers at the Justice Department look at this. John Yoo has now left the Justice Department at this point. A new set of eyes are taking a look at it, and they conclude, wait a second, we can't sign off on this. This doesn't comport with American law. There are laws on the books that talk about foreign intelligence surveillance and how it should be collected, and you have to go to a court and you have to present a case if you want to listen in on an American's phone calls or read an American citizen's emails. We can't sign off on this. And the Justice Department refused to do so under these new eyes. The White House was desperate for an extension of this program. It wasn't used to being told no. In fact, in the entire first 3 years of its White House, it had never been told no by the Justice Department before. And there ensues the famous scene where Gonzales and Andrew Card, the White House Chief of Staff, go to the hospital room of the ailing, semi-conscious John Ashcroft and try to get him to override the decision made by his own department not to sign off on the program. And As we now know, the Deputy Attorney General, who had been the one who stood up to the White House and refused to sign off, gets beeped about this as Gonzales and Card are on their way over. He rushes to the hospital to be there, runs up the steps at George Washington Hospital into the hospital room just as Gonzales and Card are there, standing over a semi-conscious John Ashcroft, trying to get his signature on a piece of paper for them to approve and ratify the program. And John Ashcroft, of all the heroes, improbable heroes in the story, sits up and says, no, and besides which, I'm not the Attorney General right now because he had temporarily stepped down while he was in the hospital. He's the Attorney General, pointing to Comey, deal with him. And Comey refused, and the White House is temporarily thwarted on that. There was an extraordinary scene that took place, not just there, but later that night when the White House made clear that it was going to go forward anyway, and the entire upper echelon of the Justice Department made it clear that they were prepared to resign. The Deputy Attorney General, Comey, all of Ashcroft's top aides, the FBI Director, Robert Mueller. Imagine that. Imagine if the public would have had any idea in March of '04, an election year, that the entire upper echelon of the Justice Department was prepared to resign because they thought that the White House was doing something that was illegal. Imagine how that might have, what the reaction to that would have been. I wished that we at Newsweek could have reported on that the very next day. I wish we could have told you about this extraordinary scene the very next day. But we did get whiffs of it. Primarily my colleague and now managing editor of Newsweek, Dan Kleidman, who was extraordinarily well-sourced at the Justice Department, had gotten whiffs of this, had been talking to sources, and we, a year or so later, first disclosed that there was this huge dispute and there was an incident at Ashcroft's hotel room. We didn't have the full story. We didn't know exactly the back and forth and all the graphic details, but we were able to give the public the first glimpses into this extraordinary debate that was going on inside the government at the time. And then as a result of our story, a year ago, May 15th, 2007, the Senate Judiciary Committee calls James Comey, the Deputy Attorney General who had stood up to the White House and now who had since left the Justice Department, was now in the private sector, and calls him up before the Judiciary Committee and asks him simple questions. Tell us what happened in the hospital room of John Ashcroft on the evening of March 10th. And he told in incredibly graphic detail, and probably one of the most gripping pieces of Senate testimony you could ever watch, this dramatic story of a confrontation over the hospital bed of an ailing man over whether or not the White House has been doing something illegal. Now, I take, some modest comfort that we at Newsweek were able to play a role in getting that story to the public and getting it known. There's always an interplay between the press and Congress and the courts and others, but this is a way the process works. This is way stuff comes out. But I said I take some comfort, because the fact is we didn't get it at the time. We didn't get it we didn't get the full story. Indeed, to this day, we don't know the full story of the surveillance program that was authorized after 9/11, how far it went, how intrusive it was, exactly why the people at the Justice Department were so prepared to resign over it. Those are stories yet to be told. But I have no doubt they will be. And I do think that if you look at the full sweep of these things, our record is far from perfect, but I do think that we've made a difference, and I do think we can continue to make a difference. So on that note, I have lots more I can talk about in aspects of this, but I'd like to stop and throw it open to questions, and it can range from this stuff to the Iraq War, which I wrote a book about in the run-up to the Iraq War, hubris, to sex scandals. So.
Questions? Anybody want to start off? Sure.
Let's start with sex scandals.
Sure.
Why did the McCain article in the New York Times say that McCain was warned not to be too cozy with some of his people? Basically, go nowhere. And the thing with New York governor become unbelievably issue.
Right. Well, that's an easy one, actually. You have to look at the stories themselves. I think it's pretty clear that the New York Times misfired on that story. It introduced to its readers the idea that John McCain had been having a romantic relationship with the lobbyist in the second paragraph of the story, which immediately colored how everybody read that story, and immediately had everybody looking, oh yeah, show me the goods. What do you got? And as you read through it, they didn't have it. They had one aide on the record saying that he had warned her to stay away from him. Wasn't exactly clear why. You had others, anonymous sources, saying they thought there might be a romantic relationship, but absolutely no evidence and proof to support it. And because they overreached and because they misfired, it colored everything else in the story about whether there was, legitimate issues there relating to McCain and his relationships to lobbyists in general. I think that it really was a colossal misjudgment on the New York Times part. Now, to compare to Eliot Spitzer, there's a criminal investigation. The guy's caught in, red-handed, wiring money, violating the Mann Act. The FBI is listening in. It isn't even a sting, for God's sakes. You can't even possibly argue entrapment. From a guy who, as a prosecutor, had prosecuted prostitution rings. So, not even close. Are there issues there about McCain and lobbyists in general that we've reported on, that we'll continue to report on? Absolutely. But I think what that story really shows is when you get into really damaging allegations relating to personal misconduct, you really have to have your ducks in order. You really have to have it right. And, that one, they didn't. Okay. Well, there was a lot. We covered the hell out of that story last year. And I was, wrote about it endlessly. There were some fascinating vignettes and aspects to the story. Particularly, I think the most problematic was the firing of the U.S. Attorney in New Mexico, David Iglesias, who clearly was, being pushed to indict a prominent Democrat in the state prior to the election to help the Republican candidate for Congress there. Since then, right, well, Gonzales resigned, so the sort of sacrificial lamb, was delivered. Bruce Fine, the Office of Inspector General, has been conducting an investigation, and essentially we're all waiting for the report on that. He's taking his time. He's one of the more solid inspectors general in the government, widely respected, but he's being very methodical about it. And until we see his report, there probably aren't going to be too many beats. I did notice that the House sued the White House yesterday for civil contempt for not turning over the documents in its investigation. I don't know when they think, a civil suit could possibly bear any fruit on this front with a White House that, has less than a year left. But, they went through the motions. I think the real next beat on that is the Fine report, which I think will probably come within the next couple of months, but, nobody knows for sure. Yes, sir. Absolutely. And there's no question that whatever, good, productive, useful stories, important stories that have been written, the history of journalism during the Bush administration will have one big black mark next to it, and that's the story of the run-up to the war in Iraq. Something I write quite a bit about in the book, by the way. But that said, it's a much more complicated story than I think partisans want. Partisans who are opposed to the Bush administration want to acknowledge. There were some pretty good stories written in the months prior to the invasion 5 years ago next week, I think, of Iraq. But they never got the traction they should have for a lot of reasons. For one, a lot of people were scared to talk. In fact, one of the really, and so the stories were based on anonymous sources. So you had the reporters at Knight Ridder, for instance, and Walter Pincus at the Washington Post, and others who were writing stories saying that there were anonymous intelligence officials in the government who didn't agree with what the White House was saying on critical issues like the aluminum tubes or mobile labs and others. But none of those sources were prepared to come forward and go public with their dissents. None of them were prepared to leak the memos and emails they were writing showing that. So you had stories from good, hardworking reporters doing the best they could, challenging some aspects of the administration's case, and then you had a full-blown propaganda campaign by the Bush White House using the full powers of the American media, including leaking stuff to friendly reporters like Judy Miller, on the other hand, stories based on anonymous sources from mid-level intelligence officials versus the highest levels of the American government in public making these claims, clearly the latter is going to get more attention than the former. I'll give you one example of a story I wrote in May of 2002. You may remember there was the claim that had been made that Mohammed Atta, the September 11th lead hijacker, had met with an Iraqi intelligence agent in Prague in April of 2001. Vice President Cheney cited it on a number of occasions on Meet the Press. And I wrote a story in May of 2002. This is well before the American invasion, saying that the FBI and the CIA had looked into this story, had checked out every aspect of it, including getting a hold of every record, all of Muhammad Atta's travel records and his rental records and his cell phone records, and concluded that the meeting almost certainly didn't take place, that there was just no evidence to support it, that he could be definitively placed in Florida the week that he was supposed to have been in Prague, and therefore it was pretty impossible, and that there was no corroboration. The allegation of this had come from one sort of source at a check for the Czech intelligence service that had been passed along to the CIA. Well, okay, I wrote the story. A couple others picked up on it. The New York Times wrote a similar story about a week or two later. A few others cited it. And then Cheney goes out and keeps talking about the meeting in Prague again on Meet the Press. It didn't stop them. And, Cheney says it. It gets reported by others. I mean, you can't, there's only so much you can do. My story was based on anonymous sources at the FBI and CIA. Did I have the CIA, the FBI director standing up and saying the vice president of the United States is wrong, this meeting never took place? No, I just had, intelligence and law enforcement officials saying we've looked at this and concluded that the meeting didn't take place. But if they're still going to say it, you can't stop the train. We are powerful sometimes, but we're not omnipotent. We do what we can. Yes, sir.
What, if anything, is the media doing about the secrecy that the President and Mrs. Clinton seem to have thrown up over the income tax returns?
Yeah. Well, we've written about it. I've written about it. I think that that's a legitimate issue. Look, that's a political issue in the campaign, and I think, the basics have been pretty well aired. I think the Obama people have a pretty persuasive point when they say, well, she's agreed to release her tax returns, but she'll do it, later down the road. Well, what about if the tax returns are useful information for the voters? Weren't they useful for all the people who have already voted? Now they're saying on or around April 15th. The around word is the one to watch there, because the Pennsylvania primary is a few days later. Does around mean after Pennsylvania or before Pennsylvania? But that's one to watch. Look, you can argue that it's actually more relevant today than it was when this issue first came up, given that she loaned her campaign $5 million. Seems to me to be a legitimate question that voters, should have answered, like where that $5 million came from. We do know that Bill, has all sorts of mysterious business dealings with Ron Burkle and Vinod Gupta, and we learn more and more about them all the time. How illuminating those tax returns will be, will they release all of them when they finally do, we'll see. And as for the Clinton Library, I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's a wealth of information there that would be of high interest to the voters, but they are doing their best to keep the lids on them. Yep.
In New Jersey, we have a situation with Correspondent emails. And the question is anything then ever private anymore that people have, or just everything's open to
well, if you write emails on government computers, ask, who's it, the mayor of Detroit about that? I think he might be able to, he's learned his lesson on that one. Look, yeah, I don't know the Corzine situation, but I do know that, look, on the other hand, we don't have the White House emails. All the White House emails relating to the U.S. attorney firings. That's one of the things that, the House of Representatives went to court on. There, a claim is being made of executive privilege. Legal claims can get thrown up all the time. Yes? No, because I think the record, I'm sorry, on whether the 9/11 Commission did their job, I read that, Yeah. I read the Phil Sheenan book and wrote about it for Newsweek, and I think Evan reviewed it for the New York Times. I thought it was an interesting read, and he talked about some interesting internal battles, and particularly some conflicts that Philip Zelikow, the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, had. But I concluded, where I think most people came down, at the end of the day, that report is a pretty damn good report. And I talked about, the role that we were able to play in shedding some light on the war and terror in the news media. But there is more interesting information in that report, including in the footnotes, than any other single government document I can think of. I mean, we really did learn a lot. I think that, the basics of the story have been told. Are there going to be sort of, new parts of it that are still classified that hasn't come out? Probably, but I thoroughly reject and don't even want to give any credence by talking about the bizarre conspiracy theories that still float out there. It's a waste of time, I thought that was the initial thrust of your question, so I just was going to say no and move on, but it wasn't, so I answered. Yeah.
I wonder what you thought the biggest change in investigative reporting was since you started, and where you see the future of investigative reporting going.
Well, good question, because of the news media is evolving, as we speak. I was talking earlier with Evan about this blog, Talking Points Memo. I don't know how many of you read it. Josh Marshall is the guy who runs it, but he recently got an award, some big prestigious award. I think it was the Polk Award, for his coverage of the U.S. Attorney scandal. And what he does is something that 5 years ago you wouldn't have a name for it. I don't even have a name for it today, but I mean, you couldn't have envisioned it. It's a mixture of blogging and linking and, some reporting and, some gossip. It's just, it's an amalgam of things, but it was able to create a critical mass around this story, in part because it played perfectly because there were little bits and pieces of it all around the country that were showing up in, different, in the various states where the U.S. attorneys have been fired, and it got some attention. So that's an example of how the news media is evolving on these issues. Now, it's not standard investigative reporting the way I was trained to do so, it's a little different medium, but it's an example of how this thing is morphing, how our business is morphing into new avenues. But at the end of the day, no matter what the medium is, whether it's a blog or a internet website or a traditional old dead tree newspaper and magazine, there is still a hunger on the part of the public to learn information about what the government is doing. And there are still people, of whom I'm one, who want to get that out, and who are going to find ways to get it out one way or the other. So, the investigative reporting in one way or another will continue, but the medium by which it gets read and seen and processed by people will no doubt change. Yes, sir.
In the old days, the public had a lot of confidence in the media in the sense that good investigative reporting might stimulate changes that were needed, either in government, locally, or nationally. And today, with investigative reporting, with all the handicaps you have with investigative reporting, do you think that the public has lost some of its confidence in the media's ability to affect change?
Yeah. I mean, look, our standing is not particularly high. I started out by talking about how, we're beleaguered as businesses, as commercial enterprises. Our power to set the agenda is far less today than it was. I mean, the Bush White House was very good at times at ignoring the mainstream media and getting its message out. I mean, this was part of the whole Karl Rove, re-election strategy from '04, doing talk radio, doing friendly media in, swing states and red states, and pretty much saying, look, we know we're not going to carry New York. We know we're not going to carry California. We don't have to talk to the New York Times. We don't have to talk to the LA Times. We'll talk to whoever we want to. We'll make our case and make our pitch, on Fox News. There was a time that, Cheney would regularly give in. I mean, it was amazing. He wouldn't talk to any of the mainstream press, but he'd be giving interviews to Rush Limbaugh regularly, Laura Ingraham, all the conservative radio talk show hosts. It was a very calculated strategy of getting their message out to their people and ignoring the mainstream media. So, I mean, look, it worked up through the 2004 election campaign because they won re-election. Right? Yes, sir.
Two questions. Is there any wind left in the sails of this administration for a run-up or a war with Iran? And secondly, are you satisfied with the results of the investigation into the death of Enforcement?
Didn't see that one coming. Yes, on the second question. On the first question, I don't know if you saw today, Admiral Fallon resigned, apparently over remarks he'd made over Iran policy and suggesting that he was not enthusiastic about a potential confrontation with Iran. So I'm sure people will see that as potentially significant. But, bottom line, I don't see any way. I mean, if people thought, Iraq was a quagmire and too big to, to pull off. I mean, a war against Iran, I don't see any way. I mean, there isn't the public support for it. There isn't the public demand for it. There isn't a casus belli there. All in spite of the fact, by the way, and I think that, it's really sad that probably one of the most unfortunate legacies of the distortions in the run-up to the war in Iraq has to make an honest debate about the threats from Iran impossible. There are a lot of people, very smart people, who always thought Iran was a more serious threat, more serious nuclear threat, more serious connections to international terrorist organizations, more long-term threat to American interests than Saddam Hussein was. But having, being enmeshed in the conflict we are in Iraq, it's been, and because anything this administration says about Iran is going to get discounted, by people who say they're just doing the same thing again. It's made it impossible for an honest assessment and debate about what to do about Iran. Yes?
Your feelings might be about newspapers endorsing candidates. I'm thinking specifically of the Times having endorsed Hillary Clinton at the time of the New York primary. I'm wondering sort of what went on behind the scenes there.
Yeah. Yeah. You think, by the way, like the White House's secret. Try asking somebody at one of the editorial boards of the New York Times or Washington Post, how they come to these decisions, and you get this clone. I mean, I know a lot of these people, and we can't talk about that, right? Newspapers have been endorsing candidates since time immemorial, right? I mean, it's not. I mean, I don't think it's any big deal. I don't know how many people actually, read them or are influenced by them. I'm sure most people read them, or people read editorial pages. But I mean, how many people are influenced by who the New York Times or Washington Post endorses on a presidential race? I don't know. No, because they really are, separate. I remember, actually, this is interesting because somebody asked me, there was a question before about the McCain story. And, there have been rumors that the Times had been working on this McCain story for some time. And, we'd heard it and actually, knew some of what the Times knew, we at Newsweek had. And I remember talking to somebody from a rival presidential campaign who was very eager to have the Times publish the story about McCain, and then noted that the Times editorial page had endorsed McCain in the New York primary. And, this person was asking me, would the news section let the editorial section go off on a limb like that if, they had some big smoking gun that was going to torpedo McCain's candidacy? And this was from a fairly sophisticated political operative asking me if I thought that would be the case. And the answer is, sure, yeah, because they don't really interact in any serious way. And, the investigative reporters working on that story would have been loath to share with anybody what they had. And the people on the editorial page certainly weren't going to consult them about making their decision. Yeah.
Michael, with all the substantive work you've done, you can't help but think about the Lewinsky situation.
Yes, sir.
Tell us how that unraveled, and also the tremendous pressure that you were apparently under at the time that you
Right.
unraveled that.
Just ask Evan that question. He knows the whole thing.
You got now?
Yeah. I spoke to Evan's class today on that very subject, and it is with all, my apologies, I'm sort of talked out on that at the moment. It is, a fascinating tale that, does show the, there was a lot of back and forth about, what are the standards on a story like that, how you make a decision, when does it become a story, and there were really honest editorial debates and agonizing about how to handle that. And, at the end of the day, it all came out in the wash, so to speak. Right. All right, I'll take... did I intend that? I don't know. All right, two more. They are in there. You and then, yeah.
Talk about the threats to print journalism. Is there a print organization, whether it's a news or company, that is getting it right now to balance their investigative reporting that concerns print jobs, also their profit that needs to be
I'm not sure I'm following the question.
Is anybody sort of were talking earlier about sort of the threats to the industry to bring the actual producers down?
Right.
Like foreign investigative journalism from your perspective. Is any of the major print media outlets doing it right now where they seem to be able to, they're going to survive long term, have both investigative reporting as big as it could be, but also actually surviving?
Has anybody figured out a way to, no. I mean, everybody's struggling, with how to do it. I mean, everybody wants to maintain, investigative reporting, I've never been a big fan of, newspapers have, investigative units that do, nothing but, and, at the Post, Washington Post, they're kind of walled off. There's a whole investigative unit that's walled off from the rest of the paper that's not doing daily journalism, that's not covering, that work on these year-long projects. I've never been a fan of that, because I think, the best stories come, the best investigative stories come when you're in the fray. When you're in, you got to be connected with day to day. You got to be talking to people who are in, there has to be that back and forth, because that's when people start to give you stuff that makes a difference. So I'm not sure that, those kind of traditional big staffs, investigative staffs, make a difference. I do think that resources are important, and dedication to, when you do get the tips, to doing the long haul. I think that's important and that's necessary. And that the reporter who gets a tip that could lead to, a very useful 2 or 3 month long project that could really break some ground doesn't get called off and forced to do day-to-day stuff. I mean, I think that's the tension. But as to how to make it all economical, no, I don't think anybody's figured it all out, particularly with the web and all that. Okay, last question. Oh, student question. All right, I'll take the student question and then yours. Last question. Student, yes.
I was wondering
You know, at times they have a point, but you know, there's a back and forth on this. I mean, they whine about it, and their whining does have inevitably an effect on editors, and you know, I mean, there's been, I thought the Times Ombudsman on Sunday did a pretty good piece pointing out that everybody thinks the Times coverage has been so favorable to Obama, and you know, he just went through their Obama coverage, and you know, they've had a fairly decent record on writing some tough Obama stories about his ties to the nuclear power industry, about the history of Resco and all that. I mean, they haven't come up with any about his voting present. I mean, that's an example. I mean, you know, that stuff has come out. I think what the Clinton people are really whining about is that nobody's come up with some, you know, killer smoking gun that's taken the guy out. That's what they want. And, you know, it may just be that it doesn't exist. I mean, I will never, you know, stipulate that as a given. I'm just saying that, you know, you get a sense of people. And Obama certainly has his weaknesses in terms of experience and all that, but I don't sense, as I have with many other politicians, that the guy is, you know, there's some deep, dark secret in his past. I could be wrong, but I'm saying I just don't get that sense about the guy. All right, last question. Last question. This guy was yes.
In the run-up to 9/11, a former national security advisor went to extraordinary lengths to remove documents from the National Archives. Have you investigative reporters ever figured out what he removed?
Good question. It's actually the first chapter in this Phil Sheenan book on the 9/11 Commission. We're talking about Sandy Berger and his truly bizarre behavior in removing those documents from the National Archives. I know what the sort of best information suggests. It was copies of this after-action report done after the millennium events of January 2000 and the threat. You know, how did the government respond to the possibility of an al-Qaeda attack in at the turning of the millennium? And you know, the best guess is that there were some copies that had some scribbling on the margins that were embarrassing to him or Clinton, most likely Clinton, that suggested that, you know, he was not as aggressive as he wanted the public to believe he was. And that would be my best guess, because, I mean, there's no other sort of known, it's all copies of that one document. There's no other known document that people have been able to identify that are, you know, that is missing, that isn't there. So that would be the best guess on that. But look, you know, there are, I said before, I thought the 9/11 Commission did a really good job. I think they did. But, you know, that said, there's still a lot of documents that haven't been declassified, that are still in the archives, that are not set to be declassified. I think the next set starts in 2009. So, you know, maybe we'll learn something then. Come back. That's next year. So I'll come back next year. Anyway, thanks.